Sometimes the most horrifying crimes begin with the simplest knock on a door. On an ordinary afternoon in September 2022, officers with the Ann Arbor Police Department were dispatched to conduct what appeared to be a routine welfare check. There was no emergency siren, no frantic 911 call, just a quiet request from a Meals on Wheels social worker who had grown concerned. One of their regular clients, Patricia Fallenstern, hadn't answered her door in several days. For most people, that might not raise alarm. But for someone who relied on scheduled meal deliveries and regular contact, silence was unusual. The social worker explained that Patty, known for her routine, had suddenly gone quiet. More strangely, her neighbor had been answering her door. That neighbor was Keith Nicely. According to the caller, Keith sometimes claimed Patty was resting. Other times he suggested she had stepped out. The explanations were inconsistent. Meals on Wheels staff had not physically seen her. They simply had to rely on his word, and something about that didn't sit right. When officers arrived at the apartment complex, they approached the unit and knocked. Keith answered. At first, the interaction felt awkward but not overtly alarming. He told officers Patty wasn't home. He suggested she might have gone to the store. When asked how long she'd been gone, he hesitated. He wasn't sure. He didn't know her phone number. He couldn't say exactly when he'd last seen her. The officers explained calmly that they only needed to confirm she wasn't inside. It would take seconds. A quick glance for verification so they could report back and close the call. Instead of cooperating immediately, Keith stalled. He talked about needing his walker. He mentioned the clutter. He repeated that she wasn't there. His resistance was subtle but noticeable. One of the officers was familiar with both Keith and Patty from prior calls. Their names weren't new to the department. Domestic disturbances, intoxication-related complaints, and arguments had been reported before. Nothing violent enough to suggest what lay ahead, but enough to establish a history of tension. After several minutes of negotiation, Keith allowed the officers inside. The apartment was cramped and messy, but that alone wasn't unusual. Then one officer moved further into the living room area. What he saw made him freeze. Patty's body lay on the floor. A plastic bag had been pulled tightly over her head and secured with tape. In an instant, the welfare check transformed into a homicide scene. Keith was immediately detained. As officers placed him in handcuffs, he insisted he had done nothing wrong. He claimed he had discovered her like that. He said he didn't know what to do. He repeated that someone else must have been responsible. Upstairs, officers called for supervisors and forensic personnel. The plastic bag appeared deliberately taped. This was not an accident. It was not a natural death. There were also visible marks around Patty's neck injuries that seemed older, possibly from prior incidents. As investigators secured the scene, they noted signs of neglect and disorder throughout the apartment. There were indications of physical altercations in the past. Evidence suggested that Keith had been staying there frequently. Mail bearing his name was found inside. Despite his insistence that they were just neighbors, their lives appeared deeply intertwined. When questioned further at the scene, Keith's behavior was unsettling. He focused on mundane concerns, his belongings, his walker, how he would manage without it. He did not display shock or grief. Instead, he appeared preoccupied with inconveniences. Detectives soon transported him to the station for formal questioning. During the initial interview, Keith maintained that he had discovered Patty's body days earlier. He claimed he entered her apartment one morning and found her lying in the living room. He said he panicked. His phone had no charge, she explained. He didn't know how to report it. But detectives immediately identified gaps in his timeline. If he had found her earlier in the week, why hadn't he sought help? Why remain inside the apartment? Why not inform building staff? Why not borrow a phone? Under pressure, his narrative began to unravel. He admitted that he and Patty had argued days before her death. According to him, the dispute centered around food delivered through Meals on Wheels. He claimed she accused him of eating or discarding her sausages. The argument escalated. Detectives pressed him about the marks around her neck. After hours of questioning, his resistance weakened. Eventually, he confessed. He admitted that during the argument he grabbed a vacuum cord. He wrapped it around her neck. He pulled. The autopsy would later confirm horizontal ligature marks consistent with strangulation. The cause of death was homicide, but even that admission was not the end of the horror. Keith told detectives that after strangling her, he left. Later, he returned. He admitted to covering her head with a plastic bag because he didn't want to look at her face. He secured it with tape that investigators would link back to him. Then came the most disturbing revelation. He confessed to violating her body in the days that followed. Medical examination later confirmed trauma consistent with his statements. Detectives were left confronting not only a killing, but acts committed after death that demonstrated a profound disregard for human dignity. The crime was not impulsive alone, it extended beyond the moment of violence into something far darker. Investigators also reviewed prior reports involving the pair. In 2019, Patty had reported that someone had tampered with her apartment lock and that personal items were missing. She had expressed fear that someone in the building was watching her. At the time, no suspect was identified. Now, in hindsight, those concerns carried new weight. Neighbors later described Keith as someone who frequently referred to Patty as his girlfriend. She, however, reportedly denied that label. The dynamic between them appeared complicated, perhaps unbalanced. Control, jealousy, and dependence may have simmered beneath the surface for years. In February 2024, Keith pleaded no contest to second-degree murder and charges related to the mutilation of a corpse. 2 months later, in April 2024, he was sentenced to 25 years to life and remanded to the Michigan Department of Corrections. For law enforcement, the case was a stark reminder that even routine calls can conceal unimaginable crimes. Welfare checks are among the most common assignments officers handle. Most result in relief, a misunderstanding, a missed phone call, a harmless explanation. Rarely do they end in homicide investigations. Yet this case underscores something deeply unsettling. Danger does not always present itself dramatically. Sometimes it hides behind polite conversation, familiar faces, and everyday disputes. An argument over a meal may sound trivial, but arguments are rarely about the surface issue alone. Beneath them can lie resentment, possessiveness, and fragile egos waiting for ignition. The officers who walked into that apartment expected to verify a resident's safety. Instead, they uncovered a carefully concealed crime scene and a man who believed he could talk his way through suspicion. But deception unravels under scrutiny. In the interrogation room, what began as denial shifted into reluctant admission. Piece by piece, the truth surfaced, not because it was volunteered freely, but because evidence cornered it. For Patty, justice came in the form of accountability. But for those who knew her, the questions linger. Were there earlier warning signs? Did past reports foreshadow what would happen? Could intervention have changed the outcome? And perhaps most haunting of all, how many other doors are knocked on each day, hiding stories we haven't yet uncovered? Because sometimes the most terrifying realization isn't that evil exists, it's that it can live quietly next door, waiting for someone to finally knock.